Real estate words and terms with meanings and examples, part number 15. Equity stripping, which means a strategy to reduce the equity in a property, often to protect it from creditors. For example, the owner took out a large loan against the property to prevent seizure by creditors. This means the equity was reduced intentionally to protect the property. Escalator clause, which means a contract provision allowing for price or rent increases under certain conditions. For instance, the lease had an escalator clause that increased rent by 3% each year. This implies rent goes up annually according to the agreement. Exclusive agency listing, which means an agreement where the broker earns commission only if they or another agent find the buyer, not if the owner sells directly. For example, the seller found their own buyer, so the broker received no commission under the exclusive agency listing. This means the owner sold without paying the broker. Exclusive right to sell listing, which means an agreement giving the broker commission regardless of who sells the property. For instance, the seller found a buyer themselves but still owed the broker commission under the exclusive right to sell listing. This implies the broker is paid no matter who finds the buyer. Fair Housing Act, which means a federal law that prohibits discrimination in housing based on race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or national origin. For example, the landlord violated the Fair Housing Act by refusing to rent to a family with children. This means the landlord engaged in illegal housing discrimination. Fee simple, which means the highest form of property ownership, giving full control and rights indefinitely. For instance, owning the house in fee simple meant she could sell, lease, or pass it to heirs without restrictions. This implies complete ownership rights. Fiduciary duty, which means a legal obligation to act in the best interest of another party, such as a client. For example, the agent breached their fiduciary duty by hiding a higher offer from the seller. This means they failed to act in the seller's best interest. Final walkthrough, which means the buyer's last inspection of the property before closing to confirm its condition. For instance, during the final walkthrough, the buyer noticed the seller hadn't removed all personal items. This implies the buyer checks if the property matches the agreed condition. Financing contingency, which means a clause allowing the buyer to cancel if they can't secure a mortgage. For example, the deal fell through when the buyer's financing contingency wasn't met. This means the sale was canceled because the buyer didn't get the loan. Flat fee MLS, which means a service where sellers pay a set fee to list their home on the multiple listing service without full brokerage services. For instance, they used a flat fee MLS service to get exposure without paying a full commission. This implies cost savings for the seller. Flood insurance, which means coverage that protects property owners from flood damage, often required in high-risk zones. For example, their mortgage lender required them to purchase flood insurance before closing. This means it was mandatory due to the property's location. Forced sale, which means the sale of a property ordered by a court or required to pay debts. For instance, the court ordered a forced sale of the home to settle unpaid taxes. This implies the owner had no choice but to sell. Forfeiture, which means loss of a property or rights due to legal or contractual violations. For example, the tenant faced forfeiture of the lease for failing to pay rent for 3 months. This means the lease was taken away due to non-payment. Front-end ratio, which means the percentage of a borrower's income that goes toward housing costs. For instance, a front-end ratio above 28% made it harder for her to qualify for the mortgage. This implies lenders prefer lower housing cost percentages. Functional obsolescence, which means a decrease in property value due to outdated features or design. For example, the home's lack of a garage caused functional obsolescence in the modern market. This means the feature made the home less desirable. General lien, which means a claim against all a person's property, not just a specific asset, to secure a debt. For instance, the IRS filed a general lien against all of the taxpayer's real estate holdings. This implies all the person's properties are affected. General warranty deed, which means a deed that guarantees the seller holds clear title and will defend it against all claims. For example, the buyer received a general warranty deed ensuring protection from past ownership disputes. This means the seller guaranteed a clear title. Gentrification, which means the process of revitalizing a neighborhood, often leading to higher property values and displacement of lower-income residents. For instance, the area's gentrification brought new businesses but pushed out long-term residents. This implies economic change causing demographic shifts. GFE, good faith estimate, which means a document outlining estimated closing costs for a mortgage. For example, the lender provided a GFE so the borrower could compare loan offers. This means the borrower sees an upfront cost estimate. Grace period, which means extra time given after a payment's due date before penalties apply. For instance, the mortgage had a 10-day grace period before late fees were charged. This implies the borrower had a short delay window. Graduated lease, which means a lease where rent increases at set intervals over time. For example, the tenant's graduated lease started low and increased every 2 years. This means rent rises according to the lease schedule. Gross lease, which means a lease where the landlord pays most property expenses, such as taxes and insurance. For instance, in their gross lease, the tenant only paid rent while the landlord covered other costs. This implies predictable costs for the tenant. Gross living area, GLA, which means the total finished, above-ground living space in a home. For example, the appraiser calculated the GLA to determine the property's market value. This means it measures the usable indoor living space. Habendum clause, which means the part of a deed that defines the ownership rights being transferred. For instance, the habendum clause stated the buyer would own the property forever and without limitation. This implies full, permanent ownership rights. Hard money loan, which means a short-term, high-interest loan secured by real estate, often from private lenders. For example, the investor used a hard money loan to quickly purchase and renovate the property. This means they used a fast but costly financing option.